I'm joined up here by three very well-known figures in the open source community. We have Evan Yu, who created Vue and Vite, Sebastián Ramírez, the creator of FastAPI, and David Cramer, the co-founder and CTO of Sentry. So notably, these projects are all quite different from each other. And I think that's sort of the interesting thing to discuss today, and really the point of the panel. So we really want to sort of jump into the things that projects can differ over. So maybe to kick it off, why doesn't each of you share how you initially got into open source?
Start with me, I guess.
Yeah, starting with you.
So I guess I started putting random code on GitHub in like 2009 or something when I was out of school working at Google, and small utilities at first, and started working on Vue in 2013 completely as a hobby project. And it was actually on GitHub way before I announced it publicly, but eventually got to a point where I felt this thing actually is pretty pleasant to use for myself. Maybe I should share it with others, and just decided to write some documentation and post it on Hacker News, and turns out people actually liked it. And so that kind of pushed me into this cycle of trying to get more features done, fix more bugs, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
What about you, Sebastián?
I think probably the first thing I did in open source was fixing a typo somewhere in some package, and like it was accepted, and I was so happy. I'm an open source contributor. But I don't know, at some point I was probably trying to use some random tool for some very weird corner case, and it was failing. And I was convinced that I was doing something wrong, and I kept digging further, and I realized it was a problem in the tool, and it was actually the case. In most of the cases, when I think it's a problem in the tool, it's not. It's a problem in my code. But in this case, it was actually true, and I contributed the fix to that, and they accepted it, and then they say like, you take care of that. You be the maintainer. I was like, what? I'm an open source maintainer for this amazing tool that has like 55 stars. So yeah, that was the beginning.
That's awesome. What about you, Cramer?
I don't know, because I think early career, early kid, I didn't know the difference. I'm just like software. There's a bunch of free software on the internet, and I think eventually I realized there's legal terms attached to the software. My earliest memories are doing a lot of work in the Django community. We didn't have Hacker News, I don't think, where I wasn't involved in it. So we're sitting on IRC and building random Django stuff. And very similar to me, in 2024, I was raging about something that was inconvenient to me in the framework and trying to fix it and or get other people to allow me to fix it. And then I think most things I built after that, I just defaulted to they were public code in some shape or form. And so it's almost like an afterthought, I would say.
And maybe Cramer, to keep going, I'm curious, how did you get started initially on Sentry as a project? And can you tell us a little bit more about what the initial set of, kind of co-contributors was to the project and how you grew that?
So Sentry was formed in this IRC channel of Django users in, 2024 minus 16. Somebody can do the math, 2008, is that right? Somewhere around there. 16 years ago, I think, next week. So it's very, very old, mind you. Simon was probably there somewhere. But it was just like a silly project at the time. And I think this is a lot of stuff. You don't have a lot of intention in software, especially when you're building open source. You're not like, oh, I'm going to build Google. I just have to start by open sourcing this thing. And so one thing led to another. It was useful, thus it became popular, and you keep working on it. But it was mostly me building it for a long period of time. And I was going to a different version of things like this with a bunch of open source people, usually in the Python ecosystem. And we'd have what we call the hallway track, which at the time was mostly us just sitting in less comfortable chairs on our laptops, hunched over, like building whatever each of our individual projects were, and then kind of getting feedback from everybody else. And that was like super rewarding for me as a young adult, I guess. But it was just a lot of that. And so it's very organic in a lot of ways. And I built it mostly independently for a very long period of time.
Sebastián, how did you go from, with FastAPI, sort of having this project that people were super excited about, and then sort of recruiting that first group of maintainers and the initial community?
I don't know how that happened. I never expected it. Like I was imagining there was gonna be like, I don't know, 50 people around the world, like 50 weirdos, hipsters saying like FastAPI is the best, and no one will listen to that. And then it just kept working and working, and people kept adopting it. Like, yeah, I was not expecting that. I think like one of the things, it's funny that one of the things that I get help the most is actually not necessarily with code itself, but actually helping others with their questions. I get so many questions in, GitHub discussions. It's just like full of that. And I get a lot of help from people in that area. I got a lot of help from all the people that built the previous stuff where I took learnings from. Like, Simon with Django, Armin with Flask. I learned a lot from all these tools, and I try to bring a lot of those ideas into one place. Also, FastAPI is built on top of Starlet, which is another project that handles all the web parts, and Pydantic that handles all the data parts. So it's just, it's a lot of building blocks that are actually doing all the work underneath. And FastAPI is fast because you run it with UV loop that was created by Yuri. And it's just like, all these is not just the project itself that gets a lot of help from people outside. It's also like the packages and like all the stuff that goes around that gets like a lot of input from everywhere.
And Evan, you've built 2 pretty large communities with Vue and then Vite. Maybe share some of the origin story behind how those communities came together and sort of who those initial folks were.
Sure. Vue has a much longer history than Vite. So for a very long time, Vue was relatively small. It was originally it was just me, but then slowly we had people contributing more actively, and we have some of the longest team members have been with us for like at least 7-8 years, and I think some of them, I don't even remember how they got on board with the project, but they've just always been around. Not necessarily contributing code, but like we have some team members who just who are actively helping, just answering questions on like in GitHub issues, and they do that for years. And some of them are more active in contributing code, and slowly we started to have, because the scope of the project also grew. So originally it was just Vue core, and then we had like routers, state management libraries, dev tools, and for each of these more concrete individual pieces, there are community members who kind of stepped up and took over more responsibility in taking care of the problems in that specific area. And I just, and you build trust over time, and I started to, just give them more autonomy and just say like, a lot of things you can just decide how to go with it, and they also kind of step into that responsibility naturally. So I would say the growth of the Vue community is really, really organic. Most of the time, people are just really passionate about a certain problem they want to solve in the ecosystem. And I just, over time, we build the trust and we just like delegate that to them. On the Vite side, it's slightly different because it's relatively younger, but also I had this like a bit more experience in seeing how the community grows. So I was a bit more intentional in setting up the team. So I was pretty early that I decided I wanted to just openly call for active contributors to consider becoming team members. And luckily we had really, really great people stepping up. And it just formed a lot, the V team just formed a lot faster and kind of got into kind of like a more self-pilot mode, autopilot mode, a lot faster than the Vue side. But it's quite interesting because now they operate quite distinctively different, but have nice things about different ways of managing teams, I guess.
Yeah. And once, maybe once you realized you had some level of responsibility to the project, I'm curious what philosophies or how intentional you were with your next decisions and sort of communicating that to all of the contributors. Maybe start with you, Evan. Okay.
I think on the Vue side, we just always had a very community-driven vibe. In general, because it's not really run as a there's no like commercial agenda behind Vue, so things are a lot more relaxed. Like when we're discussing roadmaps or what we should do, most of the time we just think about, hey, these are the user feedback, and we just talk through that. And there's no concrete timeline or deadline that we need to hit. So in a lot of ways, we're just trying to set a general direction, like say, this is what we think our users want. And a lot of times, team members have a lot of flexibility and autonomy to decide, like in their specific area, what they want to do. It's very rare that we would fundamentally disagree on what we should do. And I think that maybe only happened like 1 or 2 times. But most of the other times, I think over a really long period of time, we just build a lot of trust, and we see people just like kind of moving quite self-driven. And the way the Vue team communicates is also quite, we're distributed everywhere. We have a bi-weekly, but it's not like we set like very strict agendas or set very strict roadmaps on what each person should do. A lot of the contributions people make to the ecosystem are really just like self-motivated. On the Vite side, I guess we are a lot more, there's a closer feedback loop, but in general, it's much more driven by immediate user feedback because the Vite has a very, very diverse user base, and we have a lot of close collaboration with a lot of the higher level frameworks that builds on top of Vite. So there's a very tight feedback loop. Like we hear people say like, hey, we need this. I think this needs to be fixed. So there's a very clear list of things that we need to work on at every time. So it's quite a different way of driving things, but I myself is kind of split between 2 modes. Yeah.
Sebastián, what sorts of philosophies and sort of intentions did you make sure that the FastAPI community had to begin with?
I don't know. I think in FastAPI has been a lot of. I've been like collecting ideas from a bunch of other places and trying to put them together. In many cases, people come and ask for specific features. It's very common that people will come and ask for something, for a red button in this corner that will do this. But that's not necessarily the problem. So in many cases, it's just like figuring out through that input what is the actual problem, to know that there doesn't need to be a button, like that could happen automatically. Or maybe, it's a lever on the other side, what will be the best solution. But figuring that out, I guess like that's one of the key sources of input into like the direction. There's also a bunch of features and things that I have been wanting to add and that I have been like gradually adding that people don't necessarily will know that will be useful, but it's just like that I have been able to get a bunch of information from a bunch of different places to know that this will be quite useful and this will be quite sensible to add. In some cases, for example, one particular feature will solve like, I don't know, the 3 or 4 issues that will have potential independent solutions, but like one single thing could be able to solve everything at the same time. So I end up just going that way. But it's like balancing that out of like what I think I should build and what is people actually asking for, and trying to merge those 2 things together, I think.
Cramer, what sorts of philosophies did you bring to the early Sentry community?
Our community, so Sentry is very different in the sense of, if you abstract open source, it's just a bunch of stuff. Open source doesn't mean anything, right? So Sentry's sort of approach is arguably similar to Python, and I actually think of a lot of successful things where it is very top-down or like opinionated from sort of one person. And so early days, that was me. It's still, I think people in the company would probably say it's me. It's a little bit more spread out. The counter side is our community was mostly around language support or uninteresting things like Jira integrations. Sorry, anybody that might work on Jira. And the community was a big help in that regard. But the core server, the protocol, what the product was, what the opinions, the sort of the taste behind it, that was mostly driven by me. And even if it wasn't, it was like in very close collaboration. And that's, I think actually that's very, very important to a project. Otherwise, it kind of goes all over the place. And so it's still somewhat true today, even though I don't actually manage a lot of, I write no code for Sentry as an example, but I'm still very annoying to everybody that works at the company. So
that can't be true. Well, tell us a little bit more about who's really doing the work behind the open source projects. Like, how do these communities really sustain themselves? And maybe Cramer, we'll continue with you.
Through money. Sometimes through venture capitalists. I have very strong opinions about this. You hear Sentry, we're very big on the sustainability subject. I think it's hard, and it's very hard to commercialize open source. We're fortunate that it's natural, and then we just take all that money and we funnel it to developers. And we've actually, for a very long time, so I talked about SDKs and language support, which is a really hard challenge. Like, we now employ, it must be like 50 people full-time on just platform support. And then we also have a bunch of contractors who also do that for us. And we've actually had contractors forever. And some of these contractors, PHP community, for example, not well represented here. We've actually had a couple contractors in PHP for I don't know how long. It must be like 4 or 5 years. We had somebody in Ruby since like almost day zero. And that was a really big part of it, but we always try to pay them. Some of them don't actually want money, which is, I mean, good for them, but like, take the money. And that was such a really big deal. And it actually, the nice thing was similar, I think, to like Vue, is it was very relaxed. It's like, just send us a bill. And we actually still treat a lot of things like that. Just send us a bill for your time. It's cool. We have plenty of money. It's like, we'll pay you, you know? But we're not going to give you a roadmap or an agenda or something. And then that's kind of like the best of both worlds. And so I think the reality is you have to be able to monetize something, or, which is our model, right? Or it is like a Django or something else. But I will tell you, I think the real challenge with things like Django, and I think Taylor touched on this with Laravel, is it's almost like, how do you stay relevant when the ecosystem shifts? You know, Rails is very loud about, we don't like what everybody else does, and then we're like, we're going to do it our way. Whereas Laravel is like, okay, let's figure out, hey, you know, JavaScript developers, you could also write PHP for all these problems on the back end. And so I think that's tough, especially when you are sort of a more community-built, sort of generic framework, kind of in that space more so than an obvious product or commercial entity.
Sebastián, how does the Fast API community look, and like, who's really sustaining the project?
I have very probably opinionated opinions about community. It's very fun that it's, you know, it's a very strong word, community, and it sounds as if it was a self-sustaining independent entity, but each community is actually a bunch of individuals. And each one of those individuals is doing their work because of something, like, you know, like they're getting some type of value out of this work. At the beginning, you know, like the first months, it's just like pure excitement of, I'm building something super cool and people are liking it and it's being useful. But, you know, at some point you have to have food, you know, and pay rent and that stuff. Like, that applies almost to everyone. And, you know, like, you have to find other sources of motivation to be able to keep just doing that. Or, you know, like in some cases, it's just like, oh, you do it after hours and like on weekends, and then you just don't have a life necessarily because you have to do your daytime job. And that's something that happens to everyone. And when we say, like, you know, oh, this is just a community project or something like that, that's just each one of those individuals has to go through that. Even if it's a bunch of individuals, they have to go through that. So there has to be something that is actually pushing these projects forward. There has to be some type of value that whoever is putting the time there is getting out of it. It can be recognition. It can be, for some time, it can be just like the pleasure of building it. But in many cases, it has to be like some type of monetization or something like that. So it's like, it's something that I feel in many cases, we just think about like the nice part of the community. And many of us got into open source because, oh, it's like community. We can do things for free, and like I can use them and others can use them. And it's so cool. It sounds so cool. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind what is driving people to actually do that. You know, like, people talk about what is the buzz factor, and like, oh, there's one single person that is handling this. If a bus run over, like, we will be screwed. But I like to think about, like, what is the bus ticket factor? Who's paying the ticket for the bus for it to keep running, you know? And not just like, it might be one single person, and you can have one single person handle a project and be extremely productive and like bring something, you know, like for a very, very long time. But the thing is, that person needs to have something that is motivating them to continue. So yeah, I think it's more about what is the motivation for everyone involved than what is the size and like how is it structured, something like that.
Well, yeah, Evan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So I'll just talk a bit about how the Vue team kind of runs at the moment, sustainability-wise. We actually have, other than me, there are like almost 4 people working close to either full-time or close to full-time on Vue-related things. So 2 of them are funded directly through our Open Collective, and then we have 2 others who are partially funded, and they have essentially their own, they're either a consultant or a freelancer that builds their other source of income also based on their Vue expertise, essentially. And then the project as a whole also is funded by a combination of sponsors. I know a lot of projects are not really sustainable through just sponsors. Vue is probably an outlier with this model, but somehow we get enough sponsors that are interested to sponsor us to make the project sustainable. In a way, if you look at the amount of sponsorships we get, though, I would say the conversion rate is terribly low, given the amount of users we actually have, right? So luckily, that's still kind of enough for us to sustain the amount of maintainership and overall development time that we need to support these people working on it. But overall, I would still agree sponsorship is an extremely inefficient way of converting the value you created with open source. So other than that, we do have, luckily Vue is sitting at a layer where, because it's a framework, it has such a high exposure directly towards developers. So it's a bit easier for sponsors to justify the value in just getting their logo on our website. Or sometimes it's there are companies who are building their business on top of Vue directly, either selling Vue related services or selling to Vue developers. So it's a much more direct way for them to see the value in there. But I think for a lot of other infrastructure level projects, much more difficult, we're seeing. And that's kind of for example, for Vite, it's sitting at a lower, slightly below a framework. So on that front, interestingly, we've figured out a very different model where a lot of the current Vite team members are being full-time employed by companies where their business is critically aligned with Vite's success. So StackBlitz hires a core team member, and Astro, the framework company that also has someone who dedicated a fair chunk of time working on Vite. So interesting. So these are very different models. And on the Vue side, obviously I still spend a lot of time looking at core code, but luckily with these other team members, we're able to hand off a lot of the other pieces. On the Vite side, the core team are all working actively on Vite itself, but it's actually a mixture of people being essentially supported by different companies to work on the same thing.
Well, so one of the things that's very important for project growth is sort of the different integrations that you make with the community, and that can come in any number of formats with different language SDKs or things like that. So, or even licensing decisions, things like that. So, Cramer, do you want to share a little bit more about some of the decisions that you made, that were around sort of the ecosystem and integrating with the ecosystem that helped with distribution early on?
So I think if you treat everything like a business, it's fundamental to think about a little project, it's a business. So you think about how do you get growth, right? So adoption, growth, whatever. Our goal has always been be the default in the industry, everywhere in the industry. And so you're like, well, where are all the people? And you're like, okay, are those people going to adopt Sentry? So Sentry's fundamental view of this was web technologies, go after web. Those are the sort of emerging tech. We build a new project, we build it in some web tech. We probably don't build it in Java, COBOL, I don't know, pick some language that you don't really like. And so we latched onto that. And then you also just have to look at where the current's going. JavaScript is clearly where it's been for quite a long time. And so we look at that and we're like, lots of developers, lots of new tech, lots of bugs in our case. And so we build for that. And then it's just well, how do you support that is the next thing. But again, I just look at it as it's like a simple formula, right? Where are all the customers? Oh, there's this big pool that we've only tapped this much. Okay, we've got to get the rest of them. And I don't think it's an easy problem. And I think this is actually where open source is a model. And caveat, I'm sure somebody will yell at me, Sentry's not technically open source. But a lot of our stuff is. But that's where that distribution model, just like freemium, helps because it's a trade-off. You get something, you can run Sentry, you can use Sentry for free. You want to use it in your own thing that's not supported, well, you can just make it supported. And arguably, you can do this with APIs and everything else, right? And I think that's also why you had and have, I guess, still this big push towards interoperability through web APIs and things like that. And so that was always just ours. It's like, where's the audience? Find a way to invest in that audience and make sure they're enabled if they want to invest on their own with docs, whatever that is. Discord is the fun thing these days, so.
And Sebastián, what about the FastAPI community? What sorts of integrations and things were you intentional about that really helped with the distribution?
Things that I was intentional was making everything based on standards. So there's a bunch of open standards going underneath. Also, a lot of effort into the documentation. I probably have spent more time writing Markdown than Python because I spent a long time writing the documentation, making sure that I'm explaining each of the previous concepts before, and then thank you. And then a long time just reducing those same pages. So I write a very long thing and then I spend a long time just making it shorter. I think that helps a lot because people then end up being able to understand how to use it and being able to understand the concepts and also not just about FastAPI, but about how to build things with it, how to build APIs in general. That has helped a lot. So I think on one hand is, standards, open standards. On the other hand is making it easy to understand and to adopt. And the other thing is just being, trying to be flexible and figuring out what is the best way to integrate with things because people end up using FastAPI for a bunch of things that I didn't even expect. And just paying attention to what people are building. It's also because it's open source or open or whatever code available, whatever it is that you call it, you can integrate very easily with other things. Like Sentry has an integration for FastAPI and it's just very easy to figure out what are the points where you have to connect things. But yeah, I guess it's, as David was saying, just paying attention to the final customers or the final users and how can you serve them better, I guess.
And Evan, same question to you. What really, what with integrations or sort of the ecosystem really helped with distribution of both your projects?
Yeah, I think in the early stages of Vue, really the biggest thing is a very low barrier of entry. To this day, you can still use Vue directly through a CDN, just dropping the script tag and you're good to go. I think that was also the reason Taylor used Vue when he was checking our front end years ago. And shout out to him because the Laravel story really kind of gave Vue the initial boost of adoption that we really needed. And it kind of just went uphill from there. So on the Vite side, I think the pivotal point was, because I initially built Vite only for Vue. I was really just looking for a super lightweight dev server for myself to use. But after seeing that the idea has potential, I decided to just make it framework agnostic. And that turned out to be probably the best decision because after we pivoted to be framework agnostic, we see not just people building single page application with Vite, but also meta frameworks with it. So slowly we see SvelteKit converted to Vite and Astro converted to Vite. And a lot of these newer gen meta frameworks like Solid or 10stack or Quick, you see a lot of these essentially non-Next.js frameworks are pretty much all built on Vite nowadays. So it's actually super interesting because having these kind of clients also give us a lot more perspective on what these developers are looking for. So we are able to shape and form Vite to better cater to their needs and also make us rethink fundamentally what is the role of Vite in the ecosystem and how can we better serve that role.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today. Can we get a round of applause?